Old witch! Eat from the trash! Those were the words my daughter-in-law screamed across the kitchen table as she threw half-eaten chicken wings at my chest, the grease staining my blouse, while my son sat silently with his eyes glued to his phone, pretending not to see the humiliation splattering across his own mother's skin. In that moment, I felt not just the sting of her words or the sting of hot food sliding down my chest, but the ache of something much deeper. A wound that comes when the people you sacrificed everything for decide you are nothing more than an inconvenience, a ghost in a house you helped pay for. I stood there in the kitchen, clutching the edge of the counter to steady myself, and though my back throbbed from years of factory shifts and hospital night work, I forced myself not to bend, not to bow, not to let her see me break. Because if I gave her that victory, then every year of my life, every late-night bus ride home, every dollar saved for my son's college, every hour I worked double shifts when my body wanted to collapse, would be reduced to garbage, just like she wanted me to feel. I remember how she laughed, a sharp, glass-breaking sound, and called me useless again, asking why I was still living in their house when I should have been in a nursing home. And my son, my only child, pressed his lips together and said nothing, not even a whisper in my defense, not even a small flicker of shame across his face. That silence cut more than the insult. For a black woman of 65 who carried her baby boy through a world that often tried to erase us, who fought to keep food on the table when the jobs disappeared and the bills kept rising, who stood in lines at county offices and endured, supervisors calling me girl when I was already a mother of 3 by then. The silence of my own son was the cruelest betrayal. I looked at him across the table, hoping he would remember the years when we lived in a 1-bedroom apartment and I slept on the floor so he could have the bed, or the winters when I went without a coat so he could walk to school warm. But all I saw was a man who had traded memory for comfort, who had allowed his wife's cruelty to become his own shield. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything back. I didn't curse the way she wanted me to. Instead, I quietly picked the food off my blouse, one greasy stain after another, and laid the bones on the plate like I was setting down the years of my labor. All the sacrifices turned into trash before my eyes, but inside me something had shifted. Something heavy that had been pressed down for too long began to rise. I thought about my grandmother, who picked cotton until her hands bled and still found the strength to stand straight when people tried to break her. And I thought about my mother, who worked in white women's kitchens in Georgia and told me, "Baby, never let them steal your dignity, because once you give that up, they'll never hand it back." That night, with food sliding off my skin, I realized my daughter-in-law had mistaken my patience for weakness, and my son had mistaken my silence for surrender. The house around me felt colder than the winter air pressing against the windows, not because the heat was low, but because every wall was echoing with contempt. I looked around that kitchen, the one I had helped remodel with the last of my savings after my husband died, the one where I had taught my son how to scramble eggs when he was 7, and it felt like I was standing in a stranger's house, a place where my years, my stories, my love had been erased. I could still see my husband's hands sanding the wooden cabinets, smell the varnish from the summer we worked side by side to make this house a home. And yet here I was, being told to eat from the trash in the very space we built together. That kind of erasure is worse than any slap. It is the attempt to erase not just the person, but the history they carry. And history is all a woman like me has when the body grows old and the paycheck is gone. As I stood there, I felt the past pressing in on me, memories rising one after another, each one more bitter than the last. I remembered the long rides on the bus after cleaning office floors until midnight, clutching my son's sleeping body when he was still small enough to carry. whispering promises into his hair that one day he would never know hunger, never know shame, never see me humiliated the way the world humiliated us. I remembered the days of the civil rights marches, watching elders walk with heads high, teaching me that to survive as a black woman in America is already a kind of rebellion, that our very breath is proof we have not been broken. And I remembered my own mother's funeral, the way I swore to myself that I would never let my child forget the value of the people who raised him, never let him think that money or marriage could erase the blood that kept him alive. Those memories hurt, but they also hardened me, made me realize I could no longer just sit quietly in that chair while my daughter-in-law sharpened her cruelty on my skin. The irony was almost unbearable. I had given everything I had for my son's future, and in return, I was being treated like an unwanted boarder, like a stranger occupying space in the house I once dreamed would hold grandchildren's laughter. But life has a way of turning, of revealing what people really are when they think no one will hold them accountable. And in that moment, even as I wiped food from my blouse, even as I fought back the sting of tears, I felt something rising that had been dormant for years. A quiet, patient rage, the kind of rage that doesn't scream or curse, but plans, remembers, documents, and waits for the right moment, because I knew something they didn't. I knew that everything leaves a trace, every word, every insult, every document tucked away in a drawer. And I knew that just as quickly as she threw food at me, she could find herself on the other side of justice, with the taste of prison meals replacing the fine dinners she thought she deserved. I didn't say any of that out loud. Not yet. I let her laugh. I let my son pretend to be blind. I let them believe I was too tired, too old, too beaten down to respond. But inside, I was already taking stock, already remembering the papers my husband left me, already hearing the voices of my ancestors reminding me that silence is never the end. It is only the breath before the storm. That night, I went to bed alone, my clothes still faintly stained, but my mind sharper than it had been in years. They thought I was an old witch who could be tossed aside. They were about to learn that the witch they mocked carried fire, and fire, once lit, can burn through even the thickest walls of betrayal. That night, after the laughter in the house had died down and the television went silent, I lay awake in the small bedroom at the far end of the hall, staring at the ceiling as if answers could be carved into the plaster. My daughter-in-law's voice still rang in my ears, that vicious laugh as she called me old witch and told me to eat from the trash. My son's silence echoed even louder, like a door slammed shut between us. I turned over in bed, feeling the springs push into my hip, the ache of age heavy in my bones, and I wondered how I had ended up here, a stranger in my own blood's home, living like a shadow no one wanted to see. I told myself to be still, to gather strength, but inside my chest something restless stirred. I could not shake the feeling that this insult was more than cruelty in the heat of the moment. It was a warning of something darker beneath, a hint that my place in this house, in their lives, was about to be erased entirely. It was past midnight when I heard her voice again. The walls in that house are thin, the kind of thin where secrets never stay secret. And as I lay there, I heard the sharp click of her heels pacing the living room floor. She was on the phone, her voice low at first, then rising with excitement. She was bragging, that much was clear. Bragging about me to a friend, mocking me as though I were a burden she couldn't wait to be rid of. I held my breath, straining to catch every word. "She's pathetic," I heard her say, her tone dripping with contempt. "Always walking around like she owns the place, when soon enough it's going to be mine. He'll sign it over. You'll see." All I have to do is keep pushing, and that old woman will be gone, either in a home or in the ground. Then the house, the money, all of it will be ours. I felt my chest tighten, not just with rage, but with clarity. She wasn't just cruel, she was plotting. She wasn't satisfied with humiliating me at the table. She wanted me out of the picture completely, stripped of everything I had built with my husband and guarded all these years. I sat up in bed, my hands trembling as I reached for the old wooden dresser. Inside the top drawer, wrapped in an envelope yellowed with age, was the small tape recorder my husband had once used when he worked nights at the Union Hall, documenting meetings and grievances. I had kept it all these years, a relic of another time, never thinking it would matter again. But that night, something told me it was time. I pressed the record button, held the device close to the wall, and let her words pour into it like poison filling a vial. Her laughter, her threats, the way she talked about me as if I were already dead, it all went onto that tape. For a long moment, I just sat there in the dark, the red light glowing faintly in my hand, listening to her lay out her greed in sentences sharp enough to cut. And with each word she spoke, my fear gave way to a steady, simmering resolve. When she finally hung up, I turned off the recorder and sat back against the headboard, clutching the device like it was a lifeline. In that moment, I realized I had more than anger, more than sorrow. I had evidence. And in a world where black women of my generation have had to fight tooth and nail to be believed, where our pain is too often brushed aside as exaggeration or hysteria, evidence is the shield and the sword. I thought of my mother, how she had told me to keep every receipt, every bill, every letter, because paper was power. "They'll doubt your word, baby," she used to say, "but they can't argue with the ink." That lesson had followed me all my life, through jobs where supervisors tried to cheat me out of overtime, through landlords who tried to raise the rent without notice, through banks that charged fees I never owed. I had learned that survival wasn't just about endurance. It was about keeping a record, leaving a trail, making sure when the day came, the truth would stand taller than the lies. I lay awake until dawn, the recorder pressed against my chest, listening to the steady hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the occasional creak of the old house settling around me. My son and his wife slept peacefully down the hall, unaware that their conspiracy had already begun to unravel. I thought about the years I had spent working to keep them afloat, about the times I had lent them money from my pension, the groceries I had carried in when their cupboards were bare, the times I had paid their electric bill when the shut-off notice came. Every act of generosity had been twisted into entitlement, every sacrifice turned into fuel for their cruelty, and now they dared to speak of taking my house, the house my husband and I had built with sweat and love, the house where I had nursed my son through fevers, the house where we had gathered for every holiday until his wife decided my presence was an embarrassment. By the time the sun rose, I had made a decision. I would not be silent. I would not let their greed swallow me whole. I dressed slowly, my hands still shaking but my mind sharpening with purpose. I slipped the recorder into my handbag, tucked the envelope of old property papers beside it, and looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection showed the lines of age, the weight of years, but behind my eyes there was something they had forgotten. A steel forged in decades of struggle, a strength that comes from surviving not just poverty and racism, but heartbreak and betrayal. I whispered to myself, "They think I'm weak, but they don't know who raised me. They don't know what I carry that morning." When my daughter-in-law strutted into the kitchen, tossing her hair and smirking as she poured coffee into a cup she never washed, she looked at me like she always did, with that mix of disdain and superiority. She muttered something under her breath about, old folks who don't know when to quit. And I almost smiled. Let her think I was still beaten down, still the silent shadow in the corner, because I knew, even as she sipped her coffee and scrolled through her phone, that her words were already trapped on that tape, waiting for the moment to speak louder than she ever intended. The catalyst had come, not with a slap or a shove, but with her own arrogance, her belief that she could plot openly in the night and that no one would ever hold her accountable. She didn't realize that the woman she called a witch had been watching, listening, and preparing all along. And though I said nothing that morning, though I moved quietly around the kitchen and endured her insults once more, inside me, a fire had been lit. I carried that recorder in my bag like a secret weapon, a reminder that sometimes survival means more than enduring. It means striking when the time is right, with proof that cannot be denied. And as I left the house that day, stepping into the cold air of the neighborhood, I knew one thing for certain. She had set the stage for her own downfall, and I would be the one to open the curtain. The following morning carried with it the same stale quiet that always seemed to weigh down that house. But beneath the silence, I could feel the tension gathering, a thick rope slowly pulling tighter, as if the air itself knew that something was about to snap. I had barely slept after recording her late-night conversation, my mind replaying every venomous word she had uttered, every hint of her plan to strip me of what little I still owned. My body ached from lying stiff all night, clutching the tape recorder as though it were a lifeline. And when I finally rose from the bed, I moved carefully, trying not to let the stiffness of my joints betray the energy surging beneath my skin. I walked into the kitchen with the steady calm of a woman who had endured far too much to show weakness now. And yet inside me, I carried a storm, the kind that gathers over long years of quiet sacrifice and finally decides to break. She was already there, sitting in her robe with her legs crossed, sipping coffee as if she were queen of the house, her phone glowing in her hand. She barely looked at me, but the curl of her lip was enough to send a message. I was unwelcome, a trespasser in the space my own hands had helped build. The plate of food she had left on the counter looked cold, scrambled eggs crusting over from being left too long. But before I could reach for it, she rose with a sudden sharpness. Without a word, she swept the plate off the counter and into the trash, the sound of the porcelain clattering against tin echoing through the kitchen like a slap. She smirked as she pushed the lid down and said, "There, that's where your meals belong. From now on, if you want to eat, you can eat like the stray cat you are." Her eyes lingered on me, daring me to respond, to raise my voice, to confirm her story that I was nothing but an angry old woman, out of place and out of time. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I refused to give her that victory. Instead, I met her stare, steady and unblinking, the way my mother once looked at a landlord who tried to evict us illegally, the way my grandmother looked at the foreman who thought he could cheat her out of a day's wages. I did not move, did not speak, but I let her know with my eyes that she had not won, that the silence she mistook for surrender was the silence of a woman biding her time. My son entered a moment later, still tying his tie, still playing the part of a man too busy to notice the destruction happening in his own home. He glanced briefly at the trash can, at me standing there with my hands folded, and then quickly looked away, muttering something about being late for work. I watched him press a kiss to his wife's cheek before heading out the door, a gesture that cut deeper than any word because it confirmed what I had been trying not to believe, that he had chosen her cruelty over my dignity, that his silence was not ignorance but complicity. The door closed behind him, and she exhaled in satisfaction, as if the stage were hers alone now, as if I had no one left in my corner. She turned back to me, and with a voice dripping in false sweetness, she said, "You hear that? He doesn't care. He won't stop me. You're on your own, old woman." But she was wrong. I was not on my own, because in that moment I realized I had allies she could not imagine. Memory, evidence, and the unbreakable will of a woman who had already survived a world built to crush her. I excused myself from the kitchen and walked outside, the cold morning air cutting into my lungs, but filling me with a strange clarity. Across the street, my neighbor, Mrs. Daniels, was sweeping her porch. She was a widow, like me, with silver hair tucked beneath a scarf and eyes that had seen just as much hardship. She had once worked in the mayor's office before retirement, and people in the neighborhood still respected her sharp mind and unshakable sense of justice. She looked up as I approached, noticing the strain in my step, the heaviness in my face. "Morning, Loretta," she said softly, her voice like balm. "You don't look right. Something happen?" I hesitated, because for so long I had carried these burdens in silence, believing that to speak them aloud would make them heavier. But the memory of that plate crashing into the trash still rang in my ears, and I could not hold it in any longer. I told her about the insults, about the food thrown at me, about the late-night conversation I had recorded. As I spoke, her face grew darker, her broom stilled in her hand. When I finished, she laid the broom against the porch rail and stepped closer, her voice steady, full of the weight of experience. "You've got proof, Loretta. Don't you dare sit on it. Women like us, we can't afford to stay quiet. You keep that tape safe, and you keep every document, every receipt, every little thing that proves what's yours. Because they'll try to take it all if you let them. Don't give them the silence they want." Her words struck deep, because they echoed what my mother used to say, what every elder in my life had tried to drill into me. Silence is a trap. Silence is how they rewrite the story and paint you as the villain. I nodded, feeling my spine straighten as if her words had sewn steel into my bones. She reached out and squeezed my hand, her palm warm against mine. "If you need a witness, I'll be there. Don't think you're fighting alone." For the first time in days, I felt something close to hope, a flicker of light breaking through the heavy fog that had settled over me. I returned to the house with a plan forming in my mind, each step more deliberate than the last. The humiliation I had endured at that kitchen table, the food in the trash, the smirk on her face. Those were not just insults, they were evidence of a larger crime. She was trying to erase me, to steal not only my dignity, but my legacy. But I would not let her. I would begin collecting everything: my husband's will, the mortgage papers, my pension statements. I would keep the recorder close and ready. And when the time came, I would not be the one on trial. That evening, the cruelty returned with even sharper edges. She ordered me to clean the kitchen after dinner, deliberately spilling juice on the floor as she walked out, laughing as though I were nothing more than a servant. I knelt slowly, my knees screaming in protest. But as I wiped the floor, I kept my mind clear, repeating to myself that each insult, each act of degradation, was one more piece of rope she was tying around her own neck. I rose, leaned on the counter, and whispered under my breath, "You think I'm broken, but I'm just waiting." In the quiet of my room later, I laid out the recorder and the documents on the bedspread, spreading them like weapons before a battle. The tape gleamed with the promise of truth, the papers with the promise of ownership, and together they reminded me that I was not powerless. I had been treated like a shadow, but I was flesh and blood, and I had history on my side. Outside my window, the winter wind rattled the panes, but inside, I felt a calm determination settle into my bones. This was the first escalation, the moment when cruelty tried to break me, but instead sharpened me. And as I drifted into sleep, I knew that what had begun with a plate of food in the trash would end with far greater consequences, because I would not stay silent, and I would not surrender what was rightfully mine. The morning after my resolve had hardened into something like steel, I found myself standing at the bus stop with the old recorder buried deep in my handbag and the envelope of documents pressed against my chest inside the lining of my coat, as if keeping them close to my heart might keep me alive. The sky was grey, the kind of grey that swallows the horizon and makes you wonder if the sun has forgotten you. But I welcomed the chill because it cleared my mind. I had made the decision that could no longer be postponed. I would go to the social services office downtown, the place I had always avoided because I thought stepping inside meant surrendering, admitting I could not handle my own family, admitting that my son had become a stranger under the roof I had built for him. For weeks, I had told myself that silence was survival, that if I could endure a little longer, things might calm down, that perhaps my daughter-in-law's cruelty would tire itself out, and my son might finally remember the boy he once was, the boy who used to run into my arms after school and promise me he would never leave me. But silence had brought me nothing but humiliation, and the night of that phone call proved that endurance without action was a slow kind of death. So I stood at the stop, the cold biting into my knuckles, watching the traffic hiss along the wet pavement, and I told myself that today I would not walk away unheard. When I arrived at the building, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a pale glow over walls painted the colour of watered-down cream. The waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee left too long on the burner. Rows of plastic chairs lined the walls, occupied mostly by women who looked like me. Tired eyes set deep in faces that had carried burdens too heavy for too many years. Some clutched folders, some hushed children in their laps, and all of them wore the expression of people who knew they would have to fight twice as hard just to be acknowledged. I signed my name on the clipboard, sat down, and folded my hands over my bag, feeling the weight of the recorder pressing against my palm like a heartbeat. When my name was called, I followed a young caseworker into a small office with a desk stacked high with files and a computer that looked like it had seen better years. She smiled politely but distractedly, tapping at her keyboard as she asked me what had brought me there. For a moment, my throat tightened, because saying it aloud felt like cutting my own heart open. But then I heard the echo of my neighbour's voice. "Keep every record. Don't you dare stay quiet." And I found my words. I told her about the insults, about the food thrown at me, about the way my daughter-in-law plotted to steal the house. I told her about my son's silence, about the nights I lay awake wondering if I would be locked out of my own room. Her fingers stopped moving, her smile fading as she leaned back, the weariness in her eyes telling me she had heard versions of this story many times before. For a long moment she said nothing, then finally spoke. Her voice softened with practiced sympathy. "These are family matters, Mom. We usually encourage people to try to resolve things privately." The words hit me like a cold slap because I knew exactly what they meant. That an old black woman complaining about her family was too easy to dismiss. That my suffering was just another file to push aside. That the system was not built to protect people like me. But I had not come all this way to be brushed aside. I reached into my bag, pulled out the recorder, and set it gently on her desk. I pressed play. Out of the small speaker poured my daughter-in-law's voice, sharp and smug, talking about how soon everything would be hers, how I would either be in a home or gone altogether, how my son would do whatever she asked. The caseworker's eyes widened slightly, the lines around her mouth tightening as the venomous laughter filled the room. I let the tape play long enough for the malice to be unmistakable. Then I pressed stop and slid the envelope of documents across the desk. "This is not just a family matter," I said, my voice steady even as my hands trembled. "This is abuse. This is theft waiting to happen. And if you ignore it, you are complicit." For a moment, the office was silent except for the hum of the lights. The caseworker looked at me differently now, as if I had shifted from one more weary voice to a witness carrying proof. She cleared her throat, typed something into her computer, and said she would file a report, that an investigator would follow up, that my statement would be kept on record. I watched her carefully, weighing whether she truly believed me or whether she was simply trying to move the appointment along. But in that instant, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I had spoken, that my voice had carried beyond the walls of that house, that the silence had been broken. As I left the building, stepping into the damp air of the city, I felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter because I had finally forced my truth into the open, heavier because I knew retaliation would come. People like my daughter-in-law do not let go of power easily. They sense when control is slipping, and they tighten their grip. They lash out. They make threats sharper than before. But I also knew something else. I was no longer invisible, no longer alone with my fear. The tape existed, the documents existed, the report existed. I had shifted the balance, and once that balance tips, there is no turning back. On the bus ride home, I stared out the window at the grey streets flashing by, remembering all the times in my life when I had been told to endure quietly, when speaking up had been painted as dangerous or shameful. I thought of the years in the factory, the times I was passed over for promotions, while younger white men with half my experience walked past me into offices with windows. I thought of the times I was called girl, even after my hair had turned silver, the way my complaints were shrugged off as if my age and my skin made me less than credible. I thought of the generations of women before me, women who endured humiliation, but also carved spaces of survival out of cruelty, who left me lessons hidden in their silences and in their rare, hard-won victories. That day, for the first time in too long, I felt like I had honored them, because I had refused to let my pain be buried. By the time I stepped back into the house, my daughter-in-law was waiting, arms folded, eyes sharp. She must have felt the shift in me, the quiet defiance in the way I carried myself. She smirked, but it was thinner this time, the edge of uncertainty creeping in. "Out for a little stroll, witch?" she sneered. I set my bag down carefully, looked her in the eye, and said nothing, because now my silence was not surrender. It was the silence of someone who had already set the wheels in motion, someone who knew that the walls of that house could not contain the truth forever. That was the midpoint, the hinge where everything turned, the place where my story stopped being one of endurance and became one of resistance. I had entered the office as a victim, trembling with the weight of shame, and left it as a witness prepared for battle. The cruelty of my daughter-in-law had pushed me to the edge, but in doing so she had also exposed herself, had given me the very evidence that would one day bring her down. And though the storm was only beginning, I carried a quiet certainty as I moved through that house, as I endured her smirks and her petty cruelties. The certainty was this: she could throw food, she could spit insults, she could plot and scheme, but she could not erase me. Not this time. When I returned from the social services office, carrying with me the fragile relief of having spoken at last, I expected the house to feel the same, cold, hostile, brimming with silent contempt. But instead it greeted me with a pressure so thick it felt like walking into a storm before it breaks. She was waiting for me, my daughter-in-law, standing in the kitchen with her arms folded, her eyes lit, not with the casual cruelty she usually wore, but with something sharper, something dangerous, that told me she already knew I had stepped out of the role she had written for me. I tried to move past her, tried to reach for the kettle as though nothing had changed, but she cut me off with a voice that curled around me like smoke. "You think I don't know where you've been? You think I can't smell betrayal on you?" she hissed. And in that moment I understood she had ears everywhere, that my absence had not gone unnoticed, that perhaps even my son had whispered suspicions into her ear before leaving for work. She leaned closer, close enough for me to smell the perfume she always drowned herself in, and whispered words meant to curl like a chain around my throat. "If you ever step foot in an office like that again, I'll make sure you end up in a nursing home so fast you won't even have time to pack your things. You'll be locked away, forgotten, while we live our lives free of your bitterness." The words hit harder than any slap because I knew how easily they could become truth. I had seen it happen to women like me, women who had spent their whole lives working and giving only to have their children declare them unfit, to have signatures forged or papers manipulated until suddenly their homes were sold, their accounts drained, and they were wheeled into institutions with no one left to call their name. The fear wrapped around my ribs, but beneath it, something colder stirred. Anger, yes, but also the certainty that she had overplayed her hand. She thought her threat would silence me, but instead it confirmed exactly what I had told the caseworker. This was not a family disagreement. This was calculated abuse. Still, I could not show my hand too soon. I let her words hang in the air, let her believe she had frightened me into compliance, though my mind was already storing every syllable for the day it would be replayed in a courtroom. That night, as I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, I felt the weight of her footsteps outside my door. For the first time, she did not bother to hide her surveillance. She paused by the door, rattled the knob, and when it held, she slid the bolt from the outside. The sound was unmistakable. I was locked in my own room, a prisoner in the house that bore my name. I rose slowly, pressed my palm against the cool wood of the door, and let the truth of it sink in. They wanted me silenced, not just with insults, but with walls, with keys, with the lie that I was too fragile, too unstable to manage my own life. The betrayal was sharp enough to draw blood, but I refused to let despair seep in. I turned back to my dresser, opened the drawer where the recorder lay, and pressed it into my palm as if it were a talisman. My voice had already been set free in that office. They could not lock that away. Morning came heavy, my body stiff from a restless night. But when the bolt scraped open again, I knew I had to endure this new humiliation without flinching. My son stood in the doorway, his tie neatly knotted, his face tight with something that looked like shame but did not bloom into action. Behind him, she hovered, her smile wide and poisonous. He spoke softly, avoiding my eyes, telling me not to make trouble, that I was only making things worse for myself, that if I kept insisting on imaginary threats, then perhaps it would be best if I considered moving somewhere I could be taken care of properly. Those words cut deep because they carried his voice, not hers, and for the first time I saw clearly that he was not just her accomplice, but her echo, repeating her lies as though they were his own. I wanted to shake him, to remind him of the boy he once was, but instead I stood there quietly, holding his gaze until he looked away. The days that followed blurred into a cycle of intimidation. She would leave doors half open to remind me she could walk in whenever she pleased. She would take the phone off the hook and set it on the counter where I could see it, a silent message that my calls would not reach the outside world. She would speak loudly in the evenings about nursing homes, about how some people don't know when their time is up, about how it's better to let the professionals handle old folks before they hurt themselves. And my son, my own flesh and blood, would sit beside her, nodding silently, sometimes sighing as if he were the weary victim of my existence, as if my survival were the burden and not the gift that it was. But what they did not know was that every gesture, every locked door, every casual threat was fuel, not for despair, but for resolve. I wrote down the dates in a notebook I kept tucked under my mattress, recording the nights I was locked in, the words she spat, the silence he offered. I knew the world would not believe me without proof, but I had learned long ago that truth is not always spoken aloud. It is built piece by piece, written down, captured, preserved, until the day it cannot be denied. So I kept writing, I kept recording, I kept collecting, even as the injustice wrapped tighter around me. This was the turn I had feared, the moment when cruelty escalated into captivity, when betrayal sharpened into the threat of erasure. Yet even in that darkness, I clung to a single flame. They thought they were burying me, but all they were doing was planting the evidence that would one day rise against them. And so I endured, not as a victim waiting for rescue, but as a witness gathering the weight of truth, preparing for the day when their threats would be the very rope that dragged them down. The morning after the lock on my door scraped open for the third time in a row, I realized they were not acting on impulse anymore. They were following a plan. My daughter-in-law moved through the house with the smugness of a woman who believed victory was already hers, her laughter ringing in the halls like the sound of coins dropping into a jar. And my son, my only child, walked behind her as though tethered by invisible chains, repeating her words, nodding at her decisions, playing the part of a man who had forgotten the weight of his mother's sacrifices. I ate my breakfast in silence, the taste of cold toast turning bitter in my mouth, and watched as she whispered something into his ear that made him smile. That smile broke something inside me because it was not the smile of the boy who once promised to protect me, but the grin of a man who had been convinced that cruelty was not only acceptable, but necessary. I excused myself from the table and went into my room, shutting the door quietly so they would think I was retreating. But instead, I reached for the drawer where the recorder lay and pressed play, letting her venomous late-night laughter echo in my room, reminding me that I held a weapon she could not imagine. Later that day, Mrs. Daniels, my neighbour, knocked gently on my window, a signal we had begun using since my phone had been cut off. I slipped outside under the pretense of taking out the trash and walked with her to the edge of the street. She pressed an envelope into my hand, her voice low but urgent. "I found this while helping my niece clean her office at the courthouse," she said, her eyes sharp with knowledge. "It's a copy of the old will your husband filed years ago. Everything. The house, the savings, even the little plot of land in South Carolina. It all belongs to you alone. His name isn't on it, and certainly not hers. Keep it safe, Loretta. You'll need it soon." The paper trembled in my hands as I unfolded it, the black ink spelling out the truth I had always known, but feared they had buried. My husband had secured my future before he died, and all their talk of our house was built on nothing but lies. For a moment, the weight of gratitude almost buckled my knees. But then I straightened, sliding the document into my coat. Proof upon proof, weapon upon weapon. And with each new piece, the walls they built around me began to crack. When I returned inside, she was waiting in the living room, her phone in her hand, her eyes gleaming. "Where have you been, witch?" she asked, her tone mocking. Sneaking around with your little friends again?" I ignored her question and walked past, but she caught my arm with surprising force, her nails digging into my skin. "Don't think I don't know you're plotting something," she hissed. "But remember this. If you make one wrong move, I'll have you declared incompetent so fast you won't even remember what freedom feels like." I pulled my arm free and met her eyes, and for the first time she flinched. Perhaps she saw something there she had not expected. A steadiness, a refusal to cower. I did not speak, because words would have betrayed me, but inside I was whispering to myself that her threats were no longer daggers. They were confessions, and I was collecting everyone. That night, when they thought I was asleep, I heard them in the kitchen. Their voices carried through the vents, his lower and uncertain, hers sharp and commanding. She told him it was time to move forward with the guardianship papers, that she had already spoken to a lawyer who would make it simple, that all they needed was a signature here, a fabricated concern there, and soon I would be deemed incapable of handling my affairs. My son's voice wavered, asking if it was necessary, if perhaps they should wait. But she silenced him with the promise of money, with the reminder that everything I owned would be theirs sooner or later, and better sooner than later. I pressed the recorder to the vent, capturing their conspiracy word for word, my hand trembling, but my resolve sharpening like a blade. The next morning I walked to the market, my bag heavy with both groceries and secrets, and as I paid for a loaf of bread, the cashier, a young man with kind eyes, leaned close and whispered, "You okay, Miss Loretta? You look tired." I almost broke down then, almost let the tears fall. But instead, I smiled faintly and said, "I'm fine, baby. Just fine." Because I knew the world outside could only help me if I showed them the truth. And the time for that was coming soon. As I walked home, I thought about all the years I had worked to build this life. All the mornings I rose before dawn to clean office buildings while my son slept. All the afternoons I skipped meals so he could have seconds. To think that the very person I had poured my life into was now plotting to erase me, it burned, but it also clarified. Their greed was bottomless, but so was my will to fight. That evening, when they cornered me in the living room with papers in hand, trying to force me to sign something I could not fully see, I refused. My son shifted uncomfortably, his wife's hand pressing the pen toward me, her voice syrupy sweet as she said, "It's just a formality, Mama. Just some papers to make things easier for everyone." I looked at the pen, at the paper, at their faces, and then I pushed it back across the table. "If it's so harmless," I said, my voice steady, "then you sign it, because I won't." The room fell silent for a moment, and in that silence I felt the balance shift. She slammed her hand against the table, her mask slipping, her fury spilling out as she screamed that I was ungrateful, that I was selfish, that I was standing in the way of my own family's future. My son tried to calm her, but his voice was drowned out by her rage, and in that chaos I realized that their desperation was finally showing. Later that night, I slipped out once again to meet Mrs. Daniels, and together we made copies of the will, the recordings, the notes I had been keeping. She promised to hold them safe, to deliver them to the right hands if anything happened to me. As I handed her the envelope, a wave of calm washed over me, because I knew that even if they locked me away, even if they silenced me, the truth had already been set free. Their cruelty had escalated, their threats had grown sharper. But so had my defences. I was no longer the quiet woman wiping stains from her blouse in silence. I was a witness, a fighter, a grandmother with proof in her hands and fire in her chest. And though the storm was still gathering, I knew it was only a matter of time before it broke. not over me, but over them. The day it all came to a head began like any other, with the clatter of dishes in the kitchen and the sour taste of dread on my tongue. But by the time the sun set, the house that had once been my prison had turned into a stage where truth was dragged into the light. I woke before dawn, my heart restless, the envelope of documents tucked beneath my pillow and the recorder hidden in the lining of my bag, because I knew instinctively that something was coming. For days, my daughter-in-law had grown more frantic, her voice sharper, her threats less veiled, her determination to strip me of everything only barely contained beneath her painted smile. That morning, she was already dressed when I entered the kitchen, her makeup too heavy, her laughter brittle as glass as she poured herself coffee. She looked at me with eyes that glowed with anticipation, as if she knew that today would be decisive. My son sat at the table beside her, his shoulders hunched, his face pale, and I could see that whatever plan she had concocted, he had agreed to it, or at least surrendered to her insistence. It did not take long for the knock to come, firm, heavy, official. My stomach twisted, because I recognized the rhythm of authority, the sound of people who did not come to visit, but to enforce. She rose quickly, smoothing her dress, pretending surprise as she opened the door to reveal 2 police officers and a woman from social services. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said with false sweetness, her voice dripping with the satisfaction of someone who believes the trap has finally sprung. "We're very worried about her. She's been confused, unstable, possibly dangerous. We just want what's best for her." Her words cut through the air like a blade, and for a moment I saw in their faces that they believed her, that they had heard this story before and filed it away under the category of senile mothers, unfit to care for themselves. My son stood behind her, nodding quietly, his silence once again the most painful betrayal of all. But before they could step inside, before the lies could grow roots, I reached into my bag and pulled out the recorder. My hands trembled, but my voice was steady as I said, "If you're here to decide my fate, then you need to hear the truth first." I pressed play, and out of the small machine spilled her voice, sharp and unmistakable, mocking me, plotting to take the house, threatening to put me in a nursing home, laughing about how everything would soon be hers. The room froze. The social worker's eyes widened. The officers exchanged glances, and for the first time I saw the mask slip from her face. She lunged toward me, her hand outstretched to snatch the recorder, but one of the officers stepped between us, his palm raised, his voice firm as he told her to sit down. I clutched the recorder to my chest, the words still spilling from it, every syllable like a hammer striking the walls of her false narrative. Then I placed the envelope on the table and slid it forward, the will and property papers spilling across the polished wood. "This house was left to me by my husband," I said, my voice rising with the weight of years. "Every dollar, every brick, every memory belongs to me. And yet these 2 have tried to lock me away, to silence me, to take what is mine. They tell you I'm confused, but I am clearer now than I have ever been. What you are witnessing is not the ramblings of an old woman, but the abuse of a mother by her own family." The silence that followed was thick, punctured only by the sound of her breath quickening, her face reddening as her lies collapsed around her. The social worker gathered the papers with careful hands, scanning them quickly, her expression hardening as the truth unfolded in ink and signatures. The officers took notes, their pens scratching against their pads, and when she tried once more to interrupt, raising her voice in protest, they silenced her with a warning. My son stood motionless, his eyes darting between me and his wife, his lips parting as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. It was as if the weight of all his silence had finally crashed down upon him, pinning him where he stood. For years he had chosen to look away, to let her cruelty define the shape of our home. But now, the consequences of that choice were written across his face. What followed unfolded quickly, almost too quickly for me to process. The officers asked me to repeat my statement, to describe the nights I had been locked in my room, the threats I had endured, the attempts to force my signature on documents I did not understand. I spoke calmly, deliberately, knowing that every word mattered, that this was my chance to reclaim not only my dignity, but my freedom. The social worker nodded gravely, gathering the evidence into a folder, her eyes cold when she turned to my daughter-in-law. "You've done enough," she said sharply. "From this moment forward, you'll be answering to us." My daughter-in-law shrieked then, her voice high and wild, insisting it was all lies, that I had manipulated the recorder, that I was trying to ruin her life out of spite. But the more she protested, the more unhinged she appeared, and I could see the disbelief on the officers' faces melting into certainty. They placed her under arrest right there in the living room, her hands cuffed behind her back as she cursed me, spitting words of hatred that only confirmed everything I had recorded. My son stood helplessly to the side, his face pale, his shoulders sagging, as if the weight of his complicity had finally crushed him. For a moment our eyes met, and in his gaze I saw something like regret. But regret is not redemption, and it could not erase the years of silence that had brought us here. He reached out slightly, as if to speak, but one of the officers turned to him and said he would also need to answer questions about his role, his knowledge, his silence. His hand fell back to his side, his head bowed, and in that moment I knew that whatever bond once tied us had been severed by his refusal to stand beside me when it mattered most. When the door closed behind them, when the house fell quiet again, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my own breathing, I stood in the center of the living room and let the silence wash over me. For the first time in years, it was not the silence of fear or humiliation, but the silence of victory, of justice beginning to take root. I lowered myself into the armchair by the window, my body heavy with exhaustion, but my spirit strangely light. The house no longer felt like a prison. It felt like mine again, filled with the echoes of the life I had built, not the lies they had tried to write over it. Outside, the evening light spilled across the street, golden and soft, and I thought of my grandmother, my mother, all the women who had endured indignities and humiliations and still managed to hold their heads high. I whispered their names into the quiet, offering thanks, because I knew I had not fought this battle alone. Their strength had carried me, their lessons had guided me, and today, in this house, their legacy had been honored. The fight was not over. The courts would come, papers would be filed, hearings would be held, but the worst of it had passed. The lies had been broken, the evidence had spoken, and the woman they had tried to bury had risen instead. When the dust finally settled, and the police cars rolled away with their sirens silent, the house seemed to breathe differently, as though the walls themselves had been freed from the poison that had soaked them for years. I stood in the doorway for a long while, staring out at the street where neighbours had gathered quietly, their faces a mix of curiosity and sympathy. Mrs. Daniels was there, her scarf pulled tight against the chill, her eyes meeting mine with a nod that spoke more than words ever could. She had been my witness, my anchor, the one who reminded me that silence only feeds cruelty, and now she stood as the first to greet me on the other side of the storm. I stepped out to her, clutching the doorframe for balance, and when her hand wrapped around mine, I felt the weight of loneliness slip just a little from my shoulders. She said nothing at first, only squeezed my hand tighter, and in that gesture I knew she understood everything. that I had not just survived, but reclaimed what was mine. Inside the house, the echoes of their voices still lingered, but they no longer held power. I walked slowly from room to room, touching the furniture I had once polished with care, the photographs that had been left to collect dust in corners because my presence had been treated as an inconvenience. Now, as the light from the setting sun spilled across the floorboards, I felt a sense of belonging returning to every corner. This was the house my husband and I had built, the house where laughter had once lived, the house that had nearly been stolen but had resisted because I refused to surrender. I lowered myself into the chair by the window, the same chair where I had sat so many nights listening to their whispered schemes. And for the first time in years, I allowed my body to rest without fear. The air felt cleaner, the silence gentler, and though my heart carried the scars of betrayal, my spirit rose with the knowledge that I had fought and prevailed. In the days that followed, the story spread through the neighborhood, carried in whispers and cautious questions. People came by with small offerings, pies, loaves of bread, casseroles still warm from the oven, as if feeding me was their way of acknowledging the battle I had endured. Some asked quietly if it was true, if my own son had stood against me, if my daughter-in-law had truly been led away in handcuffs. I nodded, though each time the words caught in my throat, because admitting it aloud made the betrayal fresh again. Yet with every telling I also felt a strange strength, as if transforming pain into testimony turned wounds into weapons. I began to realize that my story was not just my own, but a warning, a lesson for every woman who had given everything only to be treated as disposable when her years grew heavy. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch with Mrs. Daniels, she poured me a cup of tea and said, "You know, Loretta, there are a lot of us who've been through something like this. Maybe not as dramatic, maybe without the police and the lawyers, but the feeling is the same. We work ourselves down to the bone, and then one day, the very people we kept alive act like we're a burden. You gave them years, but now you have to give yourself what's left. Don't let them steal that too." Her words settled deep, because I had spent so long defining myself by what I gave, by the meals cooked, the bills paid, the sacrifices made. Now, for the first time, I had to learn what it meant to live for myself. The legal process moved slowly, as it always does, but each letter that arrived in the mail confirmed what I already knew. The house and every asset tied to it belonged to me alone. The lawyer explained that with the recordings, the documents, and the testimony of neighbors, the case against my daughter-in-law was strong, and though my son's silence could not erase his complicity, the weight of the evidence fell heaviest on her shoulders. I listened carefully as he spoke, nodding, but my thoughts drifted to the image of her in that cell, eating the same bland prison meals she had once mocked me with, learning the taste of humility through a steel tray instead of fine china. It was not joy that filled me at the thought, but a deep, solemn justice, a sense that the balance of the world had tilted, if only slightly, back toward what was right. As for my son, his visits grew infrequent and strained. He came once, standing awkwardly in the doorway, his eyes unable to meet mine. He mumbled apologies, excuses, half-formed words that fell flat in the air between us. I listened, but I did not comfort him. I had no more comfort left to give. When he asked if I could forgive him, I said simply, "That's not mine to give anymore. You'll have to carry what you chose." He lowered his head, and when he left, I felt no relief, only a quiet acceptance that some bonds, once broken, cannot be mended. He was my child, but he had sided with my tormentor, and though blood ties may stretch, they cannot always survive betrayal. Evenings became my time of peace. I sat on the porch as the street grew quiet, the sky painted with the fading light of day, and I let the stillness settle into my bones. Sometimes children passed by on their bicycles, calling greetings, their voices light and carefree. Sometimes Mrs. Daniels joined me, her laughter reminding me that companionship does not always come from blood, but often from those who choose to stand beside you when the storm rages. I sipped my tea, the steam curling into the air, and thought about all the women who had carried me here. The grandmother who endured fields of back-breaking labour, the mother who bent her back in kitchens not her own, the neighbours and friends who whispered warnings and shared quiet strength. Their voices lived in me still, reminding me that survival is not weakness, but victory. I learned, slowly, that freedom does not always arrive with celebration, but often with quiet moments, with the ability to sit in your own home without fear, with the knowledge that your dignity has been reclaimed. The bruises on my arms faded, but the memory of their grip did not. Yet instead of breaking me, it became a scar I wore as proof that I had endured. I began writing in the evenings, not just notes of what had happened, but reflections, lessons, words I hoped might reach other women like me, who sat silently in their own houses, enduring cruelties behind closed doors. I wrote that silence is never safety, that evidence is power, that dignity is not something you beg for, but something you claim. And so the days passed, not in the shadow of fear, but in the quiet rebuilding of a life that was mine again. Sometimes I thought of her sitting in that cell. Sometimes I thought of my son with his bowed head. But mostly I thought of myself, of the woman who had been called a witch and told to eat from the trash, and who now sat on her porch sipping tea in the fading light, free and unbroken. I thought of the words my mother had once told me when I was young, words that echoed through every hardship and every victory. They can strip you of money, of comfort, of company, but never let them strip you of your dignity. That belongs to you and you alone. Now, after everything, I finally understood what she meant.